We begin this hour in the Middle East, where Iranian universities erupt in protests, calling for the resignation of Ayatollah Khamenei as President Trump signals his solidarity with the protesters. And for more on this, I want to bring in One America's Chanel Rion, who is live from the White House. Hi there, Chanel. We have been watching these protests grow over the weekend. The government there apologizing for mistakenly shooting down that Ukrainian airliner, but protesters believe they're just saying sorry is just not enough. First of all, how is the U.S., particularly the president, supporting the protesters there?
Well, Rachel, for now, the support comes by way of standing with the Iranian protesters, standing with those who are standing against the regime. And this is a stance of solidarity coming from the president. He put out two tweets yesterday, both in Farsi and in English. And to the Iranian protesters, he tweeted, "To the brave, long-suffering people of Iran, I've stood with you since the beginning of my presidency, and my administration will continue to stand with you. We are following your protests closely and are inspired by your courage." This is extraordinary language coming out of the executive office, considering that these protesters are out there on the streets protesting this regime, calling for the end of the Ayatollah regime, calling for senior officials and top leaders to step down from Iran. And so for the president to stand with them, to make a statement like that, both in English and in Farsi, is essentially saying that he's supporting the people's wishes, which is they no longer want to live under this Iranian regime. And these protesters have erupted, as you say, throughout the country, across campuses for the most part. We had at least 16 students were killed in the Ukrainian airline crash that was ultimately confessed by the Iranian government as being a quote-unquote accident. The Iranian government had accidentally launched a Tor M1 missile and shot down a plane of innocent civilians. And so this shoot down, and then later at first the Iranian government had denied adamantly that they were responsible, and finally they admitted it. This was almost the last straw and brought out even more protesters to take to the streets and say our government is inept, it lies to us on a daily basis, and it's killing us, as even this quote-unquote accidental shooting down of a Ukrainian airliner over Tehran exhibits.
Absolutely, Chanel. So President Trump tweeting his support Saturday for those demonstrations. But Chanel, by the protesters calling for the death of the Ayatollah, in addition to the takedown of the regime, and the president expressing his support for them, what does this say about President Trump and the message he is sending to the Iranian people?
Again, it is a message that is twofold. The president is both telling the Iranian people he supports what they are protesting, which is this bloody government that has really caused so much pain and grief to innocent people, men, women, and children. And the president is also, the second side of the president's message is a direct one, directly to a now very prone, very weakened Iranian regime. And to the Iranian regime, President Trump spoke in Farsi as well on his Twitter account. He said, "There cannot be another massacre of peaceful protesters, nor an internet shutdown." Now, I want to break off there. And he means the Iranian government has been actively censoring and shutting down for as many forms of communication as they can out of Iran. So President Trump is calling for Iran to stop this practice. The world is watching. President Trump then goes on and says later, more importantly, the United States is watching. Turn your internet back on and let reporters roam free. Stop the killing of your great Iranian people. Now, this is, this is messaging that comes back to back from President Trump stating his support of the people protesting the regime, and then it's an admonition to the regime itself saying you are suppressing and killing your people. The world is watching. Now, this is on the tail end of a Friday announcement of some of the the most harsh sanctions we have imposed on Iran to date. So Iran is really feeling the pressure, not only tangibly in the form of broad-scale sanctions coming out of our Treasury Department and our State Department, but also in statements like this, where President Trump says, "I'm standing with your protesters. They're calling for the end of your regime."
Chanel, President Trump, as you mentioned, said there cannot be more deaths during peaceful protests or a shutdown of the internet. The president also, we heard him calling for human rights groups to monitor those demonstrations on the ground so the U.S. can see what is really happening there. But finally, Chanel, these thousands of protesters are most likely risking their lives taking to the streets to protest the regime.
Yes.
So what kind of shift are we seeing in Iran?
This is an enormous, not just a geopolitical shift, but a cultural shift, one in which there has always been a resistance to the current Iranian regime. However, things have been escalating in blatant forms in ways that they have never done before. So just at the end of 2019, we saw 1,500 Iranian protesters, peaceful protesters, who were literally gunned down by the General Soleimani's IRGC military. And they literally were gunning down their own people who were simply protesting this regime. So we started off with that at the end of the year. Where the tension started escalating were all caused by the Iranian regime. They started with the attack on the U.S. embassy in Iraq, followed by their missile strikes on U.S. forces in Iraq, followed by the red flags that they started raising, vowing to avenge the death of their fallen general, vowing violence against America. Iran then went on to shoot down this Ukrainian passenger plane, first denying it, now admitting it. And then we had another incident where they escalated tensions further and arrested an ambassador to the United Kingdom. And that was all followed by even more arrests of their own people. This is just a situation that has gone from being an international situation between Iran and the U.S. to now the Iranian regime realizing their greatest adversary is their own people, and their own people are starting to rise up. And with the greatest country on earth, or the most powerful country on earth, coming up and stepping up to the plate and saying, we stand with the Iranian people who are opposing this regime, this is putting Iran in a very prone position as they start off their new year.
Right, Chanel, not just a geopolitical shift, but a cultural shift. Well said, Chanel. One America's Chanel Rion reporting live from the White House. Of course, we will be watching the protests there in Iran this weekend in opposition to the regime. Thank you so much, Chanel, for that live report.
Want to see more videos like this? Click on the link below and subscribe to One America News on YouTube. And call your cable provider and kindly demand that One America News is added to your lineup. Call and subscribe today.